We'd now like to begin our second session of the day, which is a panel discussion titled The Archive and Art History. And it's a pleasure to welcome our speakers. We're joined by Jihan El Tahri, Director, Big Sister Productions, Tain, Head of Research, Asia Art Archive, Hong Kong, Krista Thompson, Jane Crowe Professor in Art History, Northwestern University, and Simon Soon, Senior Lecturer in Southeast Asian Arts History, Universiti Malaya. This session is moderated by Elizabeth Harney, Associate Professor of Art History, University of Toronto. Each panelist will present first, followed by a brief audience Q&A. I'd now like to welcome our speakers.
Hello, everyone. I'd really like to thank the Africa Institute, Hour, Salah Hassan, and the whole March meeting team. I'm truly honored to be here. So let me start with a quote from Saidiya Hartman's Venus in Two Acts. "The loss of stories sharpens the hunger for them. So it is tempting to fill in the gaps and to provide closure where there is none." I guess I can safely say that I'm a storyteller by profession. As a filmmaker, a producer, a visual artist, and a writer, I use multiple formats to do so. But somehow, I'm always chasing the same story. So Saidiya Hartman's statement resonates with me as a daily fact. With each form of knowledge production, I'm faced with questions of narrative, ethics, contextualization, and most of all, my right to appropriate the story I'm telling from my own vantage point, given that I can only work with what I have access to. Capturing only what exists before my eyes lacks the backstory, which is vital for giving continuity and coherence to any script. So the treasure hunt, or rather the archaeological dig for pieces of archive to help me to grapple with the story I'm telling, usually takes a considerable amount of time, no matter which form of storytelling I choose to use. But before I unpack some of the complexities of being an archive practitioner, I'd like to start by sharing how I got to my obsession with archive. I've always been fascinated by flea markets. It's always amazed me how and which objects are attributed an imaginary value, and how they survive erasure. How by being given a second chance for life, their initial function mutates and somehow impacts the future. So in the late 70s, I was in my teens. I was a regular visitor to the Tuesday market, we call it Suq Talet, where the second-hand street vendors of discarded objects, we call that the rubabicchia. It's an Italian word, nobody knows where it came from. They would lay their goods on the sidewalks in the hodgepodge of old window frames, old cutlery from long-forgotten restaurants, and photo albums. They all sat side by side. And one of the vendors, one of these street vendors, always had these metal canisters of film. And when a client would come and buy one of the cans, he'd open the can, throw out the reels, the celluloid, and sell the can. The film reel was worth nothing. It was the canister that had value. So I eventually plucked up the courage to ask him if I could take the celluloid that he was throwing out. And he agreed because he was more than happy to get rid of this cumbersome, useless reels. I have no idea why I personally started collecting this endless meters of celluloid, especially that I had no means of watching the content. But slowly, to my mother's distress, I had sellotaped together these meters and meters, and I had this massive reel. Then one day, the man selling the canisters no longer had the celluloid to throw out. I asked him how come he no longer had the reels, and he said that the jewelers were now buying the celluloid off him at a very good price to melt it down for its silver content. Fast forward to the 1980s, when only a few of us were working with archives and found footage. We were at the time dismissed or even accused of laziness for trying to use material shot by other people in the past. Such imagery was considered obsolete and irrelevant. The desire at the time was to portray and consolidate a modern Africa of today audiovisual discourse coming out of the continent. Over the past 10 years, working with archive imagery has become trendy, I'd say even sexy, in both the film and the art circles. Just like the word decolonization, by the way, and both have in many ways been emptied of their content, or at least lost sight of their function, their true function. The black and white image is often used as an object of illustration of bygone times, rather than a treasure trove of clues that can allow us to reassess or piece together the erased cultures and complex social realities. I wanted to start with my flea market anecdote because somehow I feel it contains many of the elements we're trying to grapple with regarding the archive today. The erasure of the content of these reels that have become pricey rings or pendants have added a trail of missing images to already silenced histories. The liminal spaces within practically all of our stories need to be found or invented. The monetization of archive footage, luckily no longer melted down, but has limited access to those who have the means to impose the dominant narrative. Also, for most of the countries of the South, the haphazardness of where we can actually find the footage, the lack of knowledge regarding who commissioned them, who shot them, and who do these images belong to, make it extremely hard to contextualize what we see or decode the representation embedded in the found footage. Given these hurdles, Saidiya Hartman's description of the archive as a space of critical fabulations, I believe, is inevitable. Having said that, I personally do believe that the captured images, sound, and written documents are not the only major source of archive on the continent. Orality in its multiple formats, ritual, fabric, all sorts of things are rich sources of stories of the past. The Ashanti people use Adinkra symbols. Let me put this up. Oh no, wrong one. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to up. Yes. The Ashanti peoples of Ghana use Adinkra symbols to express the connection between the verbal and the visual in Akan culture. The Adinkra symbols are closely tied to history, beliefs, and traditions that represent either a popular proverb, record of historical events, and they recount folk tales and social behavior. The abstract shapes are designed to depict concepts that convey more meaning than a single word. The Akan resisted British colonial rule when it arrived in West Africa, which is part of the reason that this cultural tradition and symbols survive today. The word Adinkra means farewell in Twi language, but literally it is composed of two parts. Adi, meaning the act of sending, and Kra, meaning a message to the ancestors, which is part of the reason why they wear Adinkra clothes to funerals. Adinkra symbols are a form of storytelling. The storytelling of the wearer and the message he or she brings to the deceased, to take with them to the ancestors. It is a nuanced cultural form of communication between the living and the dead, to ensure durability of the link between the past and the present, a form of libation for the ancestors to continue protecting the living and thus maintain the chain of social memory. The Adinkra symbol Sankofa, which means learn from the past or go back and get it, depicts a mythical bird flying forward with its head turned backwards. It is not a taboo to go back and retrieve what we have forgotten. Unfortunately, the preservation of Adinkra today is more an exception than the rule. Colonial rule was a successful tool of erasure and assimilation, leaving behind few hints as to who we were, who we could have become, and what might have happened had colonialism not cut up spaces of connected societies and cultures into fragments, leaving few traces of past existences. Engaging with the archive is not simply a desire to delve into history and memory in order to look backwards, but rather to use the remnants of whatever we find of the past knowledge as a tool to reinterpret our current reality and reimagine an alternative future. So given our current reality where image and sound dominate, the question is, how do we critically interrogate this dubious heirloom? I say dubious, since all images from the 1930s until the 1960s in former French colonies were subject to the Laval Decree, which formally prohibited natives to capture or use images. Similarly, for British colonies, they were guided by the specialized technique developed by William Sellers and the Colonial Film Unit, which provided a strict framework of the kind of colonial imagery captured in Africa. To illustrate this, I'd like to share with you a very powerful work by a Nigerian filmmaker and artist, Onyeka Igwe, titled Specialized Technique.
Pulse, 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 hold and pause. Pulse, 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 hold and pause.
Okay, so basically most of the black and white images of our past are in fact the kind of representation our colonizers wanted seen. Such representation of dominant narratives unfortunately persist beyond the 1960s and the era of African independences. To give a lived example, I'd like to share another story that highlights our desperate need to re-examine dominant, well-documented narratives, just to underline that prevalent knowledge can and should be questioned and contested. When I started making Cuba an African Odyssey, every reference book and every document and every historian I spoke to categorically told me that the story of Cuban support for African liberation movements was simply a story of proxy wars during the Cold War. There was not a shred of information to indicate otherwise, no documents, no images, no oral histories telling a different story. I had no reason to contest that. It was a very unflattering version of history, but I'm talking 2000 or 2001. But one day, when I received the declassified documents that I had requested under the Freedom of Information Act, I found a single 4-line telegram which pushed me to question that narrative. Basically, it was Fidel and Khrushchev slagging each other, so I didn't really understand how that fit in. After a year of legwork and chasing what seemed to be a mirage of an alternative narrative, I managed to locate Che Guevara's soldiers who had never given interviews previously. They did indeed have a completely different, untold story to share. My excitement, though, was dampened when the commissioning editors of my film, they were all Western broadcasters, simply rejected my story on the basis that there was no proof. It took me many more months to gather personal photos, one by one, from Che's soldiers who went with him to the Congo, that served as proof that what they were telling me firsthand was indeed true. Without these images, it was quite unlikely that any of the multiple international channels that commissioned my film would have broadcast it. I'd like to share just a very little snippet of the other clip.
Dreke was the main contact with the leadership, but even he was in for a surprise.
El compañero Madison fue me va a ver y me dice, bueno, hay un comandante que te quiere saludar, que hace tiempo que no te ve, que es muy amigo tuyo. Y lleva varias fotos. Una persona, un hombre blanco, y le digo, oye, hermano, yo no me acuerdo, no lo conozco. Este comandante yo no lo conozco, ¿dónde es yo? Y pasan los días.
Inventé unas cuantas gente, quería que conocieran a un amigo interesantísimo. Invito a Raúl y estoy almorzando.
Y veo a un señor que está sentado por allá. Dice, mira, este es el comandante Ramón. ¿Tú no lo conoces? Yo no lo conozco. Hasta que el señor interviene y le dice, no chive más, Andrés. Y le dice, yo soy el Che. Ha sido una de las sorpresas más grandes que he tenido en mi vida, ¿no?
Y ninguno lo conoce. Fíjate si estaba de verdad difícil. Indiscutiblemente fueron muy capaces nuestra gente, ¿verdad? Y él va entonces a un lugar de Pinar de Arriba. Tenía una casa y ellos no se organizan. Él escogió la gente. Él quería. Y ahí sí enviamos un buen refuerzo. Fueron alrededor de 150 hombres. Bien armados. Y con una experiencia.
Eso era vital para la revolución, que nadie conociera que era el Che. El Che.
Yeah, I'm running out of time. Okay, so it was a real thrill for me to piece together bits of the puzzle. The narrative definitely suited me better. Bits of the story might indeed be critical fabulations, mine or those of Che's soldiers, but why should they be regarded as less accurate than the prism of colonial representations that we are required to claim as our history? In any case, the scattered archive allowed me to appropriate an alternative narrative. It is undoubtedly lacking, but it is just a brick in the wall, and hopefully many others will continue adding their own bricks in the edifice of otherwise silenced memories. Okay, I'm going to jump a little bit. Preservation and restoration of archive is currently the flagship of institutional funders, but the critical issues remain unaddressed. Who gets to decide what needs to be preserved and based on whose narrative? And once the footage is restored, how and who gets the right to access and interrogate both local and international collections? How do we question the representation handed down to us? And how do we fill in the missing frames of these silenced histories? I'm not even talking about copyright and who it belongs to and all this. That's another complexity. But the few Africans who do manage to access the heirloom of their ancestors, they, like many young Africans today, are in exile. Felwine Starr and Benedict Savoy's report of November 2018 on restitution unleashed a torrent of questions among artists, filmmakers, academics regarding how we reconnect with our heritage and how to grapple with this lineage of silenced images. And I think the ball is in our court today. Who else is better placed to relink that chain of social and political memory? I'd like to end on a note of homage to Akwe Enwezor, especially the work he did with the exhibition Archive Fever, which challenges us to reevaluate the accuracy of seemingly straightforward terms like archive, document, and photographic. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to get set up, and while I'm getting set up, I'll just mention, so now that I'm up here at E-Chambers, I totally understand why you kept saying that time is running out. We have this screen in front of us that counts down the minutes, so for those of you in the audience who weren't aware of that, this is our reality. Okay, so I want to start by thanking everyone at the, can you hear me, by the way? Is this okay? Okay. I'd like to thank everyone at the Sharjah Art Foundation for the invitation to speak today on this panel on the archive and art history. The last 2 days, as well as the biennial itself, have been incredibly stimulating and also moving as an homage to the legacy of Okui Enwezor. And being here has been a welcome moment to reflect on how my own thinking about exhibitions and art history have benefited from his numerous projects, including Documenta 11, Archive Fever, as Tain mentioned, and post-war, and from his presence at the Getty Research Institute during his residencies there and during which we overlapped. It has been heartening to hear the thoughtful contributions by the panelists of the last few days, honing on the relationship of the history to the present, and on the ways that artists, in addition to art historians, are also responsible or taking part in the writing of history, so that it's not merely the domain, exclusive domain of historians, as it were, but also of curators, right, through biennials and other exhibitions as formats for helping us rethink history. And so I just want to kind of contribute, make some modest contributions to today's discussion, but also to the larger conversation, thinking about how history can participate in the writing of the present, but also of the future. And for this, I'd like to raise 3 main points. And the first point I want to make is that the archive does not exist as such. There are only archives. And I think Tain actually was suggesting something of this towards the conclusion of her presentation. The point is not a purely semantic one. As the panel prompt itself admits, the notion of the archive as a final repository and arbiter of truth is an old one that can be traced in the etymology of the word itself, which refers not simply to a particular set of historical documents or records, but to a government or to specific rulers in a society, a magistrate in this case, and a building in which the magistrate operates. Right? This is a point that the thinker Achille Mbembe makes in his essay, The Power of the Archive and Its Limits, when he notes that there cannot, quote, there cannot be a definition of archives that does not encompass both the building itself and the documents stored there. The origin of the archive in the establishment, and maintenance of power, and especially the power of the ruler over the ruled, has been noted by thinkers including Mbembe, Ralph Michel-Rolph Trouillot, and Saidiya Hartman, cited in this panel's prompt, but also Anne-Laure Stoller and Ariella Azoulay, among others. But pace the etymology and theoretical formulations, the archive itself is something of a fiction. Instead, there are archives in the plural, especially since at least the 1960s, more or less coincident with post-colonialism and the civil rights movements in the US context, countless grassroots and privately initiated efforts have come into being expressly for the purpose of gathering and preserving materials as alternative efforts to national or mostly official or more official repositories and institutions. And this is aside from the kind of privately held documents that might be out there and that have to be sought out and found. In recent decades, this movement has been revived with community archives, such as the South Asian American Diaspora Archive. In the field of art, aside from a number of artist-run spaces that have included the organizing of artist files and slide registries as part of their work, there has been renewed attention to the potential of archives as sites of alternative knowledge generation, including the Arab Image Foundation. And these are some of the images from the institutions I'm going to cite. Arab Image Foundation, founded in 1997, Indonesia Visual Art Archive from 2007, Nepal Picture Library, and Asia Art Archive, the organization I'm here representing. Indeed, the history of AAA, as we call ourselves, which supports research on the recent art of Asia, itself underscores the tension between the singular and the plural. The motivation to found AAA came from difficulties encountered by Claire Hsu, AAA's co-founder and its first executive director, who discovered during her own research that, on contemporary China that the libraries and collections of SOAS in London, at the time nominally the premier institution for the study of Asia and Africa, we can talk more about the complexities and peculiarities of that conjunction, had focused primarily on pre-modern or pre-contemporary arts of Asia in ways that, intentionally or not, reinforced Orientalist and colonialist conceptions of Asia as timeless or outside history, untouched by modernity or modernism. While initially sought to remedy the imbalance by building an archive directly, by collecting books, press clippings, and documenting events as they happened, by 2010, the original methodology gave way to a process by which Asia Art Archive realigned its practice to serve as a repository of archives assembled by outside individuals and organizations. And here you see our website. So AA is primarily a digital repository, so we don't, for the most part, collect the physical archives, but actually digitize the material and leave things in place. AA currently has over 100,000 records in 49 archives available on its website, including that of Mrilanini Mukherjee, who you see as highlighted in the banner image at the top. And here you can see some of the other archives that are in our collection. Okay, so that's the first point. Second talking point, whereas history focuses on the archive as arbiter of the past, in the case of art history, that relationship is triangulated by the presence of other institutions, namely museums, a point I think Mitu Sen suggested in her electrifying and sly performance yesterday. I here will take as an example a series of exhibitions that were organized by Oscar Ho Hin Kei, an artist and curator who served as the artistic director of the Hong Kong Art Center from 1989 to 2000, and documentation for which are available at Asia Art Archive. In 1997, Ho organized Museum 97, History, Community, Individual, an exhibition that explored the questions of Hong Kong identity around the time of the handover from the UK to China. So the exhibition actually bridged the actual chronological moment when Hong Kong stopped being a British colony and returned to China. And the exhibition sought to make space for non-elites in the city, as can be seen in the long list. This is the page from the catalog that you can see the content of the exhibition. But here, you can see the list of non-juried contributors. So there were 100 people, artists who were invited to contribute, each of whom had a kind of a page, a sheet to fill, as well as teenagers who also were encouraged to contribute two-dimensional work. Right? So in this way, the exhibition was about giving voice to marginalized communities and communities that did not otherwise find representation in the city's few cultural organizations. But the main section of the exhibition was organized into three what were called museums, right? And one of them, was the pre-97 History Museum, which was a self-avowed community project that invited individuals from the general public to contribute an object that communicated the relationship to colonial Hong Kong pre-handover, in other words. Visible here are two examples. Wang Pri-san's selection of objects that includes cards, coins, and other small trinkets that fit into the pocket-sized box, as well as Yang Yui's picture, on the right, Yang Yui's picture of a black and white painting of June 4th, 1989, which of course encapsulated the main concerns that many Hong Kongers felt about the post-handover future. The third featured section, the Museum on Prehistory, the second, I'm going to go back. The second featured museum on personal histories featured 6 artists' response to the lives of 3 individuals, a social activist from the 1970s, a janitor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and a street shoe repair woman. But it's the third section, the third museum, the prehistory museum, that I'd like to spend a little more time with. And in a demonstration of curatorial, if not critical, fabulation, the third and final prehistory section, the museum featured a half-fish, half-human figure, Lo Ting, as an early ancestor for Hong Kong people. For reference, and just as a reality check, I just want to note that most histories understand the present population of Hong Kong to be descended from immigrants and not from half-men, half-fish, in case there's any doubt, okay? There's a lot of confusion now about this, so. In addition to the text in the catalog, the galleries featured a number of artworks related to Lo Ting, including a more or less life-size sculpture fabricated by Jimmy Kyung and placed in a setting in the way of a diorama at a natural history museum. The deployment of museum techniques lent the narrative presented in the exhibition a sense of veracity, something that Ho witnessed when he noted parents explaining the display to children as actually a presentation of Hong Kong history. A year later, a follow-up exhibition, so in 1998, a year after the handover, a follow-up exhibition, Hong Kong Reincarnated, New Lo Ting Archaeological Find, doubled down on this rhetoric and approach and further developed the merman narrative from the Museum 97 exhibition, presenting supposed artifacts from a dig in Nanhai with the participating artists listed as members of an excavation team. So you can see this on the right side of right page from the catalog, where the people are listed as members of Team 20, Department of Excavation, Director of Natural, District of Nanhai Research Center of Ancient History, right? The catalog, meanwhile, includes also a timeline that lays out a history of Lo Ting. Sorry, it's not translated this part, but you can see it goes all the way back to 6600 BC. And also different texts arguing for and against the truthfulness and significance of the finds. In other words, there's actually in the catalog itself texts that argue against the significance or the reality of this project, which kind of is a reinforcement of the reality effect, let's say. And exhibition photographs show that the exhibit included the model Lo Ting from the previous year, this time shorn of its setting, but now supplemented by a number of artifacts displayed in museum style. The exhibits themselves range from the model to historical representations of Lo Ting. You can see this on the right, the kind of wood block print images, to supposed artifacts such as bones and tools used by Lo Ting society, and even a wearable costume that visitors could put on to experience what having a fishtail would be like. As Ho described it in an essay written for Asia Art Archive after we had digitized the collection and made it accessible, quote, "I invited academics and art and cultural practitioners who cared about Hong Kong to recreate our ancestral history and to expand it according to the little information we had. This was not just mythical fabrication or invention. The supplementary information we added reflected what we thought were metaphors for Hong Kong's unique cultural history." Both exhibitions focus on the museum format in their exploration of questions related to representation and inclusion. And this brings up another basic point that I would like to contribute to the panel, which is that while the archive stands in a relationship of truth, return to this point, relation of truth to history writing in general, in art history that relationship is triangulated by the museum, which stands for canonicity, and art history holds both in tension. So this is something for us to bear in mind in our discussions. Aside from the clear interest of Museum 97 and Hong Kong Reincarnated, the two exhibitions staged during the handover of Hong Kong during its entry into what, at least from some views, was a post-colonial status. I want to point out that the documentation from host projects comes not just from his own archive, part of which has been received and digitized by AAA, but also from the archive of Ha Bik Chen, another artist who, in addition to making sculptures and prints, also happened to visit thousands of exhibitions during his long career, which began in the mid-century, and who from the 1980s began to photograph the exhibitions that he visited. And what you can see on the screen now are the two entries from AA's archive, where you can see where the material related to the Hong Kong Reincarnated exhibition could be found, as well as on the right, the Ha Bik Chen archive where you can see where the 97 exhibition should have been, but he didn't visit that. But he did visit the 98 exhibition. You can see that highlighted, right? So it's coming from multiple sources. So, and this brings me to the third point I'd like to make, which is that archives function as resources for historians to address not just the silences of history, which is, I think, the prompt that we as panelists received, but also the prolixities, the overabundances and overproduction of certain discourses, right? And I'll get to this point in a moment, okay? So through the digitization of Ha's archive, and this to address the silences first, through the digitization of Ha's archive, AA sought to make possible a writing of Hong Kong's own art history, especially after decades when it was seen as an afterthought to either the United Kingdom, its colonial administrator, or of China, its cultural motherland, and to which it now was returned. In other words, because of its status as political and cultural colony, it was deemed to have no proper art history of its own. Ha's papers, with their thousands of exhibitions, suggested otherwise and comprise elements for the writing of such an art history. But it also demonstrates the property of at least some archives, which is that they can be less about the individual from which they come than about their surroundings and communities, their social networks. This point may seem banal, but in working with archives, the where and when a document or piece of information come from can be just as important as the content of the document itself. The metadata, in other words, is just as crucial for our understanding of the information as the data itself, right? Thus, that the Hong Kong Reimagined exhibition exists in both Oscar Ho's papers and Habiction's tells a researcher something about how the exhibition circulated and was experienced by others. And another example, and I'd actually like to kind of just show you these two images. So this is an example of some of the contact sheets that Ha printed out of the exhibitions that he photographed, and there literally are thousands of these. And these are from 1989. And so they were around the time of the June 4th massacre. And you can see that there were Hong Kong exhibitions that kind of responded to that. And currently, those contact sheets are not available because of Hong Kong law, okay? So this is about the silences, but now I'd like to turn to kind of the prolixities, right? So with regard to the prolixities, I'd like to kind of take another example, which is from a project that AA is currently developing, which looks at the archive of the artist Zohor Al-Akhlaq, frequently considered a pivotal figure in the development of both modern and contemporary art in Pakistan, and this is from his archive, partly for the way that he introduced elements from traditional art practices, such as miniature painting, into his own work, partly because he was a professor and partly because he was a professor at the National College of Arts, Lahore, where he mentored the generation of artists who emerged in the 90s and after, Shazia Sikandar, Imran Qureshi, and Rashid Rana among them. Now, the archive allows us to move beyond existing scholarship, which in some ways there has been scholarship since Zohor's death in 1999, but it's been mostly limited to specific bodies of work and specific facts. And so the scholarship will be able to make use of the archive to expand beyond that once it's available. But one thing I want to kind of point out is that in addition to kind of allowing us to understand his development of a new idiom, and also his relationship to tradition, which I think are known aspects of his career, there are aspects of his life and his work that the archive allows us to move beyond, and that includes his travel. So for instance, you can see here a trip that he took to Shanghai in the 1990s, and also here, photographs of Scheherazade Alam, who was his wife and also an artist and ceramicist in her own right, with Toshiko Takaezu, who was a ceramicist from Hawaii who taught at Princeton, right? And I was actually really surprised to find these photographs in the archive because I had no idea that they would have known each other, but it was really kind of amazing to think about the kind of the overlap intersections between Takaezu and Scheherazade Alam and Zohor Akhlaq. And I think that this is what I mean about the archive's ability and maybe the need of historians to address prolixities, because given the preponderance of national art histories, what an archive can do is also suggest the way that artists and others' trajectories move beyond those kind of givens and allow us to understand those histories in other ways, often transnational ways. And I want to conclude with this photograph of Zohor Akhlaq with Geeta Kapoor on the left and Vivan Sundaram. I think Vivan is obviously in the show, and if I understand correctly, Geeta they were originally meant to come, but for health reasons they aren't able to make it. And so I leave this here as a tribute to them all. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. So I'd like to echo my thanks to the Sharjah Art Foundation and Maria and her team for this invitation. And I apologize if I burst into accidental fits of cough. Okay, I'm not feeling that well. So the title of my talk is taken from a statement made by James Francis Warren, who is a social historian who worked on the social history of prostitutes and rickshaw pullers in early 20th Singapore, where he calls for a history of imaginative drama and narrative sweep. And I wonder if that's possible to be applied to the art history that we write as well. So let us start by considering the following photographs: frontal and profile views of a Malayan man, 1868 to 1869. They belong to a series of type photographs connected to the figure of John Lamprey, then librarian of the Royal Geographical Society and Assistant Secretary of the Ethnological Society of London. Lamprey commissioned the series to devise for both artists and anthropologists a system for the comparison of measurement of individuals by some common standard. Now, the subject here is staged against a background screen divided into 2-inch squares by means of silk threads. Lamprey argues that by doing so, the body can be scaled so that a comparative form of analysis of the races can be established, contributing, of course, then to the growing field of anthropometry. It turns out that these seemingly scientific photographs were taken by a Henry Evans, who was described as a photography and scientific instrument maker. The subject remains anonymous, but the cast within this photographic series is quite diverse and includes, of course, the African male, the Chinese male, among others, right? It is unclear how the subjects were recruited, though the models were likely seamen. Then this includes the Malayan male that we see here on the screen. Normally, the morality tale here ends with the deconstruction of the photograph taken as exemplary of the colonial gaze and its attendant epistemology. Yet I think a more salacious history is waiting to be told. In a strange twist of event, appearing in the records, newspaper records, was also that the photographer Henry Evans was embroiled in a high-profile court case. During the court proceeding, it came to light that the models who posed for this scientific commission were also instructed to pose for a separate series of pornographic photographs, none of which have survived the case where Evans was charged for his duplicity. Evans' entire stock was ordered to be burned, a huge loss given it could be a forerunner for the porno edition of the United Colors of Benetton. But what I wanted to register here is the loss is not what did not make it into the archive, namely porn, but that it exemplifies certain kind of loss. Its existence is only known through inferences. What it offers is, however, an invitation to imagine, which complicates our story of the photographic subject a little, giving us a Malayan male with a bit more color, a bit more will, a bit more life. In this sense, science redeems the occasion by presenting us with a surviving image of probably the first Malayan in the field of international porn. Now, the archive is a crucial repository of documents for the magical ingredient called sources that researchers of the past relied on to conjure a persuasive story about the history of art called a narrative. So sources provide insights into the lives of artists, their works, and the societal transformations that took place during a particular period in time. Typically, how we engage the archive falls into two approaches: to read along it or to read against it. Though the two approaches share a similarity in engaging with the archival materials, they differ in focus and objectives. When you read against the archive, it involves actively challenging the dominant narratives, and seeking to uncover hidden or marginalized perspectives and experiences that may have been deliberately excluded or silenced. Reading along the archival grain, on the other hand, according to the likes of scholars like Laura Ann Stoller, involves critically examining and engaging with the archive's materials in ways that considers their historical and social context with the goal of uncovering the underlying power structures that shape their production and preservation, revealing marginalized perspectives and experiences that may have been excluded from official records and narratives. And as seemingly different as they are, I think the purpose of our panel today is that we're trying to think through Saidiya Hartman's suggestion that these are not mutually exclusive in her argument about the purpose of that critical fabulation might serve. Contrary to what the term fabulation might suggest, Hartman points to the exercising of narrative restraint as a key procedure to any fabulation when we construe as critical. Hartman suggests that while in reckoning with the lives of slaves who were rendered invisible by history, a practice of narrative restraint is not only encouraged but necessary. This means refusing to fill in the gaps and provide closure, respecting the black noise of their experiences, and imagining a realm of experience that lies between social and corporeal death. By attending to and recruiting the past for the sake of the living and interrogating the production of our knowledge about the past, we can hopefully establish who we are in relation to who we have been. Hartman cites Octavia Butler's Kindred as a model for this practice, in which the protagonist comes to accept that the lives of her enslaved foremothers made her own existence possible. So what are the sources then that we can rely on to conjure art history? This question may sound a bit rhetorical, but as a scholar interested in social history and also in ritual practice, the very object of my study is often moving, elusive, and slippery target. But that doesn't mean that there aren't better masters for me to learn from. And during the pandemic, I was very taken by the work of Matthew Rary's research on a particular type of protective amulet that gained traction along the expansive circuit of the Portuguese Empire. And this is a case in example. Between the mid-17th and late 18th centuries, apotropic objects called mandigas circulated in places like Madeira, Cape Verde, Brazil, Angola, and Portugal. These diverse regions were bound together by the governance of the Portugal Empire and the movements of African ideas generated through the transatlantic slave trade. Almost all information about these objects, including the only extant mandigas from this period, survives in the trial records of the Portuguese Inquisition. An example can be found in Jose Francisco's trial records, right, which states that his mandigas also commonly included sulfur, gunpowder, flint, bullets, the bone of a dead man's finger, copies of St. Mark's prayers, and a vintém, a small and Portuguese coin. Rary argues that the inclusion of such disparate objects was not incidental to Francisco's accumulative aesthetics. A man enslaved and put on trial by Portuguese authorities, Francisco may have wanted to redirect and reimagine the forces behind these symbols, as he did for bullets and orations. In this way, Francisco recasts his own need for protection as the Inquisition's contradictory insistence on defining orthodoxy and sacrilege as it plays out inside the mandiga, an effort to make sense of, to process the religious pluralism that the Portuguese Empire had wrought. Matthew Rary's argument that the mandiga's seeming indecipherability and visual banality are not just matters of current scholarly debate, but were core aesthetic strategies themselves in the bowels of the slave ships, in Brazilian plantations, and in Portuguese cities. I think his argument is that enslaved Africans came into contact with new cultural practice and identity conceptions, which they not only had to navigate, but often had to take up and make their own as means of survival. I think why I was so taken by Rary's scholarship is that it points to what is at stake in our approach to knowledge making. It is not so much that the archive silences and the erasures perpetuates dominant narrative and excludes marginalized communities and individuals from historical record is that they are there, and it allows and requires us, they are inviting us to sort of like pay a closer attention to what are the materials that are available there. Along the same thinking, that was what spurred my interest to collaborate with Ahmad Fuad Osman. His discovery of Harun Aminur Rashid's 1957 novel Panglima Awang really spurred his imagination. And though fictional, the novel offered a window to imagine a world through the perspective of a protagonist from the Malay archipelago. The first circumnavigation around the world by Magellan Elcano expedition in 1519 has over time gained allegorical significance, marking the start of the age of globalization. And yet the story of heroism, tribulation, and adventure is primarily often told through a Eurocentric lens. Records, however, show that amongst the 270 crew members who undertook the perilous 3-year-long expedition on 5 ships was an enslaved Malay sailor and interpreter named Enrique de Malacca. This insight offers us an opportunity to revisit this historical moment from the perspective of a person who came from the Malay archipelago. So the exhibition that I eventually collaborated with Ahmad Fuad Osman was the 4th iteration of the Enrique de Malacca Memorial Project. The project was previously staged in the Singapore Biennale in 2016, the Sharjah Biennale here in 2019, and more recently after that was at his retrospective at the National Art Gallery of Malaysia in 2019 and 2020. When we decided to stage this exhibition again in 2021, we wanted to offer a new response and a new perspective to the recent 500-year anniversary of the circumnavigation. And this required us to move away from trying to heroicize Enrique and think about perhaps some of the problematics of how we can stage this exhibition. Principally, what we did was to sort of like create a structure of 4 chapters to think of Enrique as, in terms of creolization, to problematize the idea of the picture or the peta, to rethink what it means to operate as a subject within the high seas, and also to think of the afterlife of Enrique as a heroic sort of like figure, and problematize how we continue to receive and talk about this figure, especially when the narrative is largely bereft, or there's a very stark absence of a female voice within this story that we're trying to tell here. So drawing on the historical and presently unused Malay terminology for the word museum, Sekolah Gambar, or the picture school, repurposes a local interpretive frame to question the standard museological process, its authority over interpretations of the past, and the legitimization of grand historical narratives. The artifacts assembled for the display possess diverse provenance, some historical, some tenuously linked to the past, some completely reproduced and fabricated, others functioning as stand-in, and some that are simply speculative and fantastical. By way of assembling and staging a wide variety of artifacts, images, and objects, the artist directs us to pay closer attention to the different types of voices, claims, and meanings that images and artifacts can activate, moving beyond the simplistic binary of East and West. What we try to do in our chapters is to underline that each images have certain are powerful containers of memories, visions, and ideas that do not simply represent, but actively shape collective historical consciousness. In doing so, the artist as historian exceeded even as they explored the contours of history writing to underline Enrique's relevance precisely because we know so little about him. Perhaps in thinking about Enrique as a form of representation, what we try to highlight were two major points here. Whether his home was in Sumatra or Malacca, the close distance that separates Enrique in Mactan from his birthplace, his place of birth is magnified appearing as a chasm in his history of globalization. Yet this chasm between the veritable historical record and the speculative conjecture opens up new possibility for us to revisit the history of globalization. If Enrique did achieve freedom and found his way home, we're never quite sure because we don't know whether he actually made it home. His homecoming would have been a bittersweet experience. More than a journey around the world, it was a journey from servitude towards freedom. His freedom would mean that he could now chart his own future, but we also know that in this future, he completely disappeared from historical records. So an artistic practice can build on this limitation by drawing on the threshold concept of creativity. In the creative space, one is open to asking questions that might otherwise sound ridiculous, explore connections that are absent, and speculate possibilities that haven't been ventured. When informed by historical thinking, artists exercise their artistic license through their artwork to enrich, broaden, and enliven our historical imagination. And the second point that we wanted to make here was this acting on remembrance. As statues of prominent colonial officers are now being pulled off their pedestal in a public spectacle of decolonization, it pays to remember that decolonization is also a complex process and with a history beyond its currency today. The retelling of Enrique de Malacca in the fictional novel of Panglima Awang in 1958 can be situated within this important historical juncture. In this sense, the novel is symptomatic of a decolonial ambition. The renaming speaks to the context of nation building in search of predecessors and heroes that could serve as an ideal image to guide the new nation, not just towards prosperity, but also to a kind of seeming glory. Today, our society is a lot more critical of such idealistic promise. Perhaps instead, we now understand decolonization not as an angle, but a process and conversation that needs to take place over a long period of time. In that way, I think Scholar Gamba proposes an approach. More than determining the right historical answer, the exhibition invites us to entertain all plausible outcomes and scenarios. Yeah? To push, therefore, the terms of fabulation a little further, I like to conclude by exploring the work of Eddie Wong's Portrait of Jungle People, Sampalo, in the form of mythotechnesis or machine fictioning, when an artist and researcher is faced with the absence of archival sources. So I want to play this a little bit just so that you get a sense of the hallucinatory quality of the work. So through the use of AI technology, what the artist was trying to do with the work is to open up new avenues for thinking about history and culture that might come to bear on certain epistemic convention of conventional approach to the archival. The genesis of Portrait of the Jungle People is a personal story, beginning with the tacit knowledge that despite bearing a portrait that is not of his grandfather on the tomb, family members of Eddie continue to perform the perfunctory visit to the tomb every year during the Qingming Ancestral Commemorative Festival. He later learned that the tomb was actually empty, and all he knew about his grandfather was that he entered the jungle as part of the communist insurgency against the British colonial government. Eddie turns to the use of AI animation to explore what he describes as the artist's family history and family rhizome to honor the offshoots who can neither be traced nor mapped through a series of fragmented narratives and post-memory. Eddie uses an early version of text-to-image machine learning model called VQGAN plus CLIP. The model is able to generate images based on text prompts expressed in natural language. Today, this text-to-image model has gained widespread popularity through platforms like DALL-E, Midjourney, Stable Diffusion. Moreover, the text-to-animation models such as Runway is also getting more and more attention. But what is worth noting here is this short amount of time for AI technology to gain widespread usage, right? As an early adopter of the technology, it took Eddie up to 6 months to complete his AI-generated video. he began by interviewing friends and family members to build up an oral historical account, and from this he could then outline the story and build up a library of sentences and phrases to be transformed into prompts that the AI model can understand. Reflecting on the impulse driving the project, he said, "I tried to invent a new record that embraced the slipperiness of memory and construct new ways of inheriting its myth. It also made me realize from the Malayan emergency and the colonizing power of Great Britain that has shaped the distinctive myths, identity, and memories of Chinese culture in Malaysia." Writing on Eddie's work, the curator, Denise Lai, suggests that perhaps the resort to machine learning in Eddie's understanding of his family history fulfills a purpose that is not illustrative, but actually generative. She further notes that Eddie is able to multiply his reality by the thousands through the resulting compositions churned out by the machine. Because his grandfather left no material traces, we must concentrate our attention on his memory left on Earth in the form of Eddie's personal and public database. And here I share on the screen a bit of the type of prompts that he uses in order to activate the animation. The outcome is an animated history that is both fluid and hallucinatory, as scenes aggregated as half-form composite evoke both pictorial tableaus that are familiar yet strange, with the animation constantly shifting away from any sense of fixity. In turn, the dynamism of the moving tableau appears as if a reverie-like evocation of the past that is always on the verge of being fully grasped. The aggregation of an inconceivably large amount of data is something that our human mind can only faintly grasp. Yet it seems like machine learning is holding out a different horizon of promise for the archive, one that has critical fabulation built into how it can allow us to dream about our past with words. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for that really rich and provocative set of papers. I have to apologize. I forgot my glasses today, so I'm using Krista's, so I have to just move in and out here a little bit. So I just want to say that it was a real privilege to be asked to moderate this panel, because this is such an issue that's so important to all of us, whether we're historians, curators, or artists, in terms of relying upon and wrestling with the nature of the archives. Whether we're thinking about reading against the grain or along the grain, we're always kind of struggling to figure out how to rely on them to create our own art historical narratives, while grappling with their incompleteness, the deliberate silences within them, and often the destructive fictions within them. And I just thought, this panel works also so well with some of the panels from yesterday, where we were looking at artists who were working researching in or intervening within the archives. And I just wanted to also reflect back on what Jihan started us with, which was that, of course, Okwe's practice was so much about the archive, if not, archaeologies, right? So I thought it might be good to just read a little quote from his Archive Fever, because it really does focus on how much artists lead the way here, lead the way for us. He writes, "The contemporary artist serves as a historic agent of memory, while the archive emerges as a place in which concerns with the past are touched by the astringent vapors of death, destruction, and degeneration. Yet, against the tendency of contemporary forms of amnesia, whereby the archive becomes a site of lost origins and memory is dispossessed, it is also within the archive that acts of remembering and regeneration occur, where the suture between the past and the present is performed." So I thought that, might set the tone for the conversation. I just have a couple of observations about themes that sort of unite the papers, and then I'll open it up for discussion. First of all, I was, of course, all of you touched on these familiar questions about loss in the archive, lack of access. I really like, Krista, your notion of the disregard and its relationship to care or lack of care. But also Simon's, in the last bit about the AI artists, this idea that things were only known by inference, right? So there's always this kind of almost like a rumor or a myth or a sense that something should. So I think these ideas also of thinking through other forms of the archive that are not just written papers, as you all have also mentioned, the kind of nature of the archive. What is it? What constitutes it? What are its materials or its materiality? Could be fabrics. Quite strikingly, I thought all of you focused quite a bit on oral histories, speech acts of one form or another. This question of sociality that you bring up. It's about talking to each other during these periods of Black studies. So I thought, the notion of orality was quite important. And then I just wanted to mention also there's a real strain of focusing on collective action and community and other forms of archives, and sort of a coming together to think through what's important in the archive or what's missing in the archive. So that kind of collective action I thought was really striking. And finally, I also thought many of your papers were quite, someone spoke the other day about hope. I thought they were all quite forward-facing, and despite all the sort of challenges that we have when working in the archives, there's a real sense that all of us have to understand that we are also in the process of making archives as we do our work, and how can we do that ethically, responsibly, and what are the potentials there? So I think, Krista, your talk about a kind of being open to the elusiveness of some stories, what could have happened is part of that. Simon's questions around the horizon and this notion of sort of an interactive AI database that leaves more space for things to come. Very much focused on that. And even, Jihan's work on this notion that you're putting a brick in the wall for others to follow. I thought that was really powerful. So I could open up the floor to questions.
Hello, thanks very much. I'm Sonia, I'm an artist. Despite Okwi's very compelling quote, which you read out in the end, and also something which Simon, you touched on, I still wonder how and how much the spirit of the archive accounts in the question of withdrawal. And when I say withdrawal, I mean self-will withdrawal, which is perhaps artists or the archiver, not the archiver, artists or people concerned are making a case for mortality against immortality and do not want to be archived. And by which I don't mean this whole, we can't, of course, escape the fact that in today's day and age, there will be proliferation of images, information, etc., which is not the same as an archive. An archive is a very careful, contextualizing and putting together of information and material. And there are other concerns, there are other examples too. For example, works which actually preempt disappearance, ephemeral works which are meant to, disappear in time, or especially in the context of post-coloniality, discussions on post-coloniality, decolonization, events, catastrophes which are irrepresentable.
I guess I don't know if I'm going to be responding accurately to your comment, but one thread of conversation I never quite pursued was the difference between source and archive, right? And I wonder if sometimes we collapse them and we make them too collapsible into one another, but it feels like, for me, it's important to sort of like make that distinction. As an art historian, the source might not necessarily live on in the archive, and in fact, the archive is not always that type of institutional space that can accommodate all different types of like sources. But our fidelity is towards sources, right? When we construct the history or to try to know the past, what we're looking at is not sources, it's not necessarily archive. Archive might be the institution we have to grapple with.
Thank you so much for this incredible presentations and the talks. There are two questions here, so I think we'll tag team it and then send it back to you. My name is Metha, and I think one of the biggest things that I get from these talks is kind of thinking about archives as spaces of critical fabulations, but also as kind of a critical space for resisting and pushing back on against colonial narratives. And because of this, archives sometimes become this space where, a very personal space where, and the process of archiving also becomes a very personal process where we learn and unlearn the ways in which we situate ourselves in our trajectories and the larger trajectories of the context we exist in. And so I'm really interested in that. And I'm really interested in kind of personally preserving and unpacking the archives that are present in my family and in the communities that I'm a part of here in Sharjah. And so I think and I read and I talk a lot about that and about what it means to situate oneself in the process of archiving and in the process of unpacking archival material, and how that kind of deeply changes and transforms oneself in the process. And so I'm really curious to hear about that in your own experiences of kind of working with archives and unpacking archives, kind of for advice, because I'd love to learn more about that and learn how to navigate that, because it can be really difficult, emotionally laden processes, and I'm just really curious to hear more about that, and I'll pass it on.
Hi, I'm Tatiana. I'm her best friend. So I resonate with this question, and I think it kind of ties in quite directly with the one that I'm going to ask. My question is for John, and I'm curious about how the Asia Art Archive is responding to kind of these changes in law in Hong Kong, especially in light of the umbrella movement and the protests in 2019. The question of how to protect these narratives, I guess specifically narratives that are kind of like pushing back and resisting against the colonial. I'm curious about how you all are responding to that, if you lean on other grassroots archives. Yeah, and then my follow-up question to that, this is more out of curiosity, is I'm wondering if there has been another attempt at Hong Kong incarnated or reincarnated in light of these more recent questions about the future of Hong Kong. If you could speak to that as well. Thank you.
So I'm gonna answer actually all three of them. Just about mortality and immortality, I think one of the very interesting thing about archives is the way they resurface and the way that the invisible and the visible, what becomes archive. I just saw an exhibition the other day from Libya, where everyday objects like the bottle, a bit like in one of the presentations where there was a box of things, and how these become archive. So the thought of what will become an archive is not necessarily what will eventually become an archive. And then there's the other element of our own bodies as an archive, which I think is really important and that is neglected. Okay, then I'll go back to, I think documenting, just collecting the archaeology of finding things, and then the stage after that, which is once you found it, at what point do you start thinking, what is this? And then when do you decide, even if you found it, whether you should use it or not? All these different steps. Now, obviously, I spoke right now from this vantage point of the colonial, but it goes way beyond that, because the whole narratives, to borrow from Kojo Ishun's idea of the history and memory, these are two very separate things. What we actually find in the archive very often is the mythologies of what has been decided by the powers that be, that this is going to be the narrative, whereas our memory and our family pictures sometimes come up with a completely different narrative. And in a way, that what I was trying to say with the little clip I showed from the film, is that nothing was there to open the door to that alternative narrative unless you went from door to door. And just to very briefly say that every single one, Che went to the Congo with 123 soldiers. And they were called 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, until 123. Finding them obviously was very complicated, but once you did, there was this suspicion of like, why are you coming so many years later? And every single one of them absolutely categorically said there isn't a single image. And it wasn't until 2 years later, after talking to them many times, someone said, well, okay, I have a picture. And then the pictures start coming, and then you suddenly realize that each one of them actually has almost an archive. So when it comes out, like in that clip, which we didn't finish, I have 7 pictures of Che being disguised. Not one of them came from the same source. And everyone said, oh, there's only one of these pictures. So how you put it together is the narrative.
Okay, so maybe I'll address the last question first, since that's like most directly related to addressed to me anyway. Very simply, I guess for the most part, the archives that are digitized do not concern Hong Kong, and for the most part, are not necessarily affected by anything that's happened in the last few years politically, and so all of that material is available online. There are a number of records that now are concerned by, have been affected by legislation that has been passed. And so the contact sheets I showed you actually are not currently available online. They are available still, but you have to request permission to see them. And that has to do with the ambiguities, the deliberate ambiguities in legislation about what is considered historical and what is considered propaganda at this point. And so I think that's a kind of a direct answer to your question about what AA is doing. I think the larger question is what do people feel comfortable saying and not saying? And I think that was something, and what do people say and not say? And I think that was something that I tried to kind of underscore by pointing to the 2 projects that Oscar Ho did, because these are not things that were being said in public anyway, or being said in print. And I think Oscar wanted to get at a certain kind of mood that maybe is not discursive. And I think that there's a lot of things that maybe don't make it to the level of explicit text. And so by fabulating this myth, or by actually amplifying, let's say, because there is a kind of, there are mentions of loating in historical texts, but it's really not as a kind of, archaeology of the Hong Kong people or anything like that. It's more a kind of a figure, a kind of mythological figure. But by amplifying it and turning it into a kind of a source for the Hong Kong people, he wasn't, on one hand, commenting on a certain anxiety that Hong Kong people felt beginning in the 1980s when the handover was basically agreed on between the UK and China, to the moment of actual handover, right? And then ever since then after as well. I think, what people felt was a certain kind of identity as Hong Kongers, right? That they didn't feel before, precisely because Hong Kong was a place of immigrants. And at a certain point that kind of coalesced, but it was a fragile coalescence, right? And so the kind of the myth of loating was an attempt to kind of get at that. And I think bringing it back to the question of the archive, sometimes what a historian may have to do, or a researcher may have to do to understand a situation, is not look for explicit texts about something, but actually kind of look indirectly and, and think about the kind of the ways that what content or information may be there is not necessarily the primary kind of, you can't read it literally, in other words. It has to be also about thinking about it symptomatically almost. Like what is being said and how is it being said, and what are the gaps, what are the prolixities, what are the silences, and what does that tell us about what is happening, and not taking anything on face value, I guess. And so that doesn't change. That's always been the case. And I think that, one thing that some of us who have been accustomed to operating in a kind of a Western context maybe understand archives in a very different way than people who are familiar with political regimes where that kind of openness is not a given, right? And so the archive always has to be read in a very kind of between the lines way. Does that answer your question?
I have the mic. Sorry. Or all I need is one mic. So, okay, I mean, I have actually, it's a question and a comment, because it's about other kind of archive beyond the critical fabulation, which help fill some of the gaps. The kind of albums that you talked about, Jihan, of the black soldiers who contributed to the mission that headed by Che Guevara in the Congo. There is also an archive of the enemy, which is for the lack of a better word, I call it the archive of the enemy, or the bad side, or the other side, and that was revealed in 3 cases where there was a total defeat of that type. Whether you think about the Nuremberg, or you think about there is a very interesting book that's done by Jacob Lamini, a historian. It's called The Terrorist Album. And it was also, he managed to get a copy of something that was very well known during the apartheid regime, of about 7,000 documents of photos that were available to the police to chase anti-apartheid activists. 1 copy remained. I think he got it, and part of it is also he managed to pursue other people to do archival work. Then there is the Khmer Rouge, which are very notorious for documenting their own terror. And the same with the archives of Saddam Hussein security, which was found in Suleimania after the invasion of Iraq. So that's one example. But there is also the other example that until now, there is no easy access to it, which is the archives of the Portuguese, especially the security. And that is several, Antonio Tomas and many people who worked on Cabral or the assassination, they couldn't get to it. And that archive exists. And there's a very interesting work by Angela Ferreira, who works a great deal with Numancia, about actually the architecture of that archive. It's a symbolic work, but it's an interesting work. Is that the case of the Portuguese, where they are not revealing any access to it. And I was actually going to ask you about, since you're kind of familiar with the French case, is that the Algerian for a long time has been trying to get their hand, asking as part of the reparation, which was not really mentioned in terms of the restitution debate, is to hand over the archives of the era of the occupation of Algeria, which has a lot of information that could have corrected many wrongs. They only accepted the case of the mathematic teacher because of the persistence of his family in terms of gaining the archive. So I was wondering, because there was one thing that actually in your film that point to that kind of the enemy's archive is which I was wondering actually about to ask you again. How did you manage to convince Devlin to speak in that? Yeah.
Was Devlin in this film or the other film? I can't remember. Okay, I'll start with the other question first, and we'll talk about Devlin later. I think one of for me, what has been very important, partly what John was saying, is to imagine what was around the archive. And more than actually finding the archive, like for Egypt's Modern Pharaohs, the trilogy I did, I knew that I wasn't going to get anything out of the Egyptian government. So a lot of my chasing was chasing the logs of the archive. It took me more time to find the logs and to access it. And one of the things, for example, is that again, for the Egypt's modern pharaohs, I found an old cameraman of Sadat who had been assigned the job to burn the archive, but had actually hid it. He hid it in his basement. And so that took a while to get to the basement itself. And in the past, obviously, before cassettes, you had the DAT tapes and you had the image. So it is kind of a treasure hunt, because sometimes you find the DAT tapes, and so you know exactly what happened sound-wise, but you can't find the image and the opposite and all of that. So the finding the log, the sound, and the image, hallelujah, doesn't happen often. But to get to the archive of the enemy, the enemy often, there are moments, and I wanted to talk about also the film we saw a couple of days ago, John's film. That was a gap, a moment of time that opened, that allowed you to access this footage. And in my case, again, for the Egypt film, it was this moment in time where you had 5-6 months where suddenly everything was open, and suddenly you found out there were even documents from the Ministry of Interior flying about, and then the gap closes and nothing comes out. So I think it's about spaces that can keep these elements when the moments of opening up, well, I don't know if I'm answering it. But I think the individuals' memories are never complete, but there's always the very minimum common denominator. So I interview, like in any of my films, there are about 20, 25 people speaking, but I interview between 100, 150 people, and on camera, not the research. And so you kind of have this very, very common denominator that allows you to think that part of this narrative exists also from the enemy side. I don't want to, enemy, I'm just using enemy because you used enemy. Larry Devlin was a very interesting case because I went to see him, not for the Cuba film, but for a film I did 10 years earlier, and he would not give me an interview. And I basically harassed him for the next 5 years. After the film came out, I was still harassing him. And so he didn't really understand what this was about. And so we kind of kept in touch. So when I got to the Cuba film, as you can see, he was almost dying. He was on a ventilator, but there's this moment where I think people want to leave a legacy. People want to get it off their chest. And he just looked me straight in the camera and said, I got orders from this specific person to do this specific thing, and gave me all the details. What's in the film is just a minute. I have 7 hours of that interview. And each one of them, what you find in the film, what we leave behind as archive, as artists and filmmakers, is just scratching the surface.
I think, Salah, what you're saying kind of, for me, makes me think about what Simon's point about the difference between the archive and the source. And researchers don't necessarily need an archive to contain the information that they're looking for, but they need sources, and there are multiple sources. And I think part of what has been really interesting is, over the last few days, is understanding, like, you know, the way that people are already working with different forms of sourcing information, sourcing what they need in order to write the histories or to prepare the work that they have, and that's been very inspiring, I guess.
What are some of the more interesting sources that have entered the Asia Art Archive?
The interesting sources.
Yeah, I'm very curious in John's case, what are some of the more interesting sources that have entered the Asia Art Archive? Different types of sources that you can think of.
I can think of one. Party lists. I did a film about Saudi Arabia, and like finding anything was hard. And I managed to get the lists of all the dinners and the parties and the lists of people who went to the Aramco this and so just piecing together who was in the same room at what time, I managed to make connections I would not have made.
I think that, yeah, that's a really important point, which is, I think, you know, when maybe there is a kind of a stereotype or an image of the archive as kind of containing neat, just, you know, kind of answers to your questions, and you just kind of, but sometimes what has to happen is the pieces of the puzzle are kind of have to be put together before you get the answer that you're looking for, and they're not necessarily a sentence that says something. It could be like something else, that like a party list, or, you know, a phone number, you know, someone writing someone's phone number, or something else that, you know, or someone writing blackness on a sheet of paper, right? And that tells you something that leads you somewhere else than maybe where you think you could go. So, I don't know. I mean, I can tell you other things, but maybe I need to think about all about it.
Yeah, hi. I'm Esther Sakac. I'm a curator. I'm from Hungary, and I'm part of a grassroots initiative of Biennial, and we were also Lumbung members at Documenta 15. And I also have a question to Jihan. I'm a huge fan of your work. And yeah, not just the Cuba and African Odyssey, but also the tragedy of the Great Lakes and Behind the Rainbow. And what I really, really love about your practice is how you treat archival materials and narratives not just as frozen in time or illustrative of one thing, but you really long distance, which I really admire. And so I just have a simple question. You already touched upon it a little bit, but and yeah, just extending on the question you also posed in your talk a little bit, but navigating these really, really complex situations, I'm just curious how you see your role, or how would you describe your role as a filmmaker? So what is it that you, yeah, how would you say your practice is?
Obsessive. The truth is, I don't do anything if I don't need an answer. Like all this, I want to know. So this isn't about anybody else. All this thing about audiences and things, that they must exist, but I'm totally uninterested. The minute I want to know, and I keep scratching, now I do recognize at some point that I have to stop, so I stop. And that's why I started by saying that somehow I seem to be asking the same question. I just come at it from another angle. What I see my role as inside my films is this connecting platform. I'm just connecting dots and not engaging with the content. It's not mine. I'm just trying to figure it out. But yeah. But I do, I've, in the last film, because there's very little, and there's very little that is very intentionally hidden away, I leapt into something I hadn't done before, which was using fiction films as archive. And it took me a while to make that decision, but because fiction has elements of the time, the texture, and you can say things in fiction that you can't say in reality. I think anything can be an archive. And like everybody was like, what, you can use fiction? You can't use fiction as archive. But fiction is a very important part of the archive because it captures a moment that you don't capture in newsreel and you don't capture in other stuff.
We probably, just one more question, I think, because we have only a minute remaining.
Thank you so much. I learned so much from this panel. And you mentioned loss, absence, the need for fabulation. Also would like to bring up abundance. And I would like to do this from the standpoint of my work at the Venice Biennale Archive, researching the presence of the Global South in the post-war era, and I ended up with a wealth of documents, about some 35 countries. And from this standpoint, I will be able to challenge some of the mythologies that the art world actually from the Global South produces about itself. And so I'm doing the other kind of work, right? Because these mythologies don't even do justice to the actual presence. And these documents about, most of this stuff is correspondence. So it's not just the Biennale talking to itself, it's actually a correspondence between the Biennale and Global South, art institutions and actors. So I just wanted to, bring up this abundance possibility as well. Thank you so much.
We have one more question at the end over there. I think we can wrap it up. Sorry.
Thank you for letting me ask this question, especially to you. I've been bothering him from the beginning. This was a really fascinating panel. My name's Mavish. I spoke about revolutionary papers yesterday, but another research collaboration I'm in is called Archives of the Disappeared, where we think about the challenges of archiving and documentation in places, sites, communities, subject to mass repression, violence, destruction. So very relevant. What strikes me as a lot of your speaking is actually not archival absence, but archival abundance. As long as one understands the archive not as the state institution or like the MoMA archive, but as much more broadly. As many things, and I think Jihan mentioned body, and she mentioned fiction, and so for that reason, I wonder if the job perhaps is not. There's a lot of talk about archival absence nowadays, which is very, very important, but it seems to me, especially in light of the fact that you have to go to a flea market to find film reels. In Lahore, in Pakistan, there's a very famous Sunday book market, where all book collectors go because on the street, booksellers are selling very rare materials. So they're there. Revolutionary papers and magazines are in the basements of dying political workers. They're like, you have to trace up, old uncles and sit with them and listen to them for 4 hours before they give you their photos. So it seems to me, sometimes I'm concerned that a focus on archival absence may result in us not realizing that there is actually an abundance of material out there that we need to start. We really need to, there's so much work needs to be done. For example, the 4,000 surveys that you mentioned, right, that maybe not all are there, but you have 40, and then there's lots of people who were surveyed, who are in the community. And especially because often a community itself can tell the story. It's interesting, Jacob Labini came up, because one of Jacob Labini's main arguments in the Terrorist album is one of the tropes around South African history has been, if we just had access to the apartheid state's archives, we would know the truth. And he says, well, once you look at the terrorist album, you see that the repressive regime, doesn't know what it's talking about half the time. It lies, it distorts, it's deeply racist, it miscategorizes even people according to their own racial matrix. So just because you get access to certain regimes' archives doesn't mean that you have more of the truth. People already told you the truth about the apartheid regime. It was already there, if you know. So I wanted to ask you to reflect on that. Alongside that, one of the reactions, of course, very importantly to the question of archival absence has been, for example, trying to think about critical fabulation, AI, which Simon spoke of, which was really interesting. I just wonder, what if one took another approach? Because absence is totally there, I recognize that, but to refuse to fill in the absence, to let it stand, and without, and what are the politics and the ethics of filling in the absence with something that we make up in the present, which reflects our current concerns and the current context within which we live? What's the ethics and politics of that? And last, given that we're talking about absences, finally, it's not a question, more of a comment. I know you won't have time, but I was thinking also very much about this event. What would be the archive of this event? And what would be the absences and silences here of the Sharjah Biennale in terms of, South Asian labor migration, which is happening around us, what would that look like? So thank you so much.
I think we have to leave it there. Thank you so much, everyone.